China, the United States and the European Union have committed to reduce carbon emissions. The United States by between 26 and 28% by 2025 on 2005 levels, China to cut by 2030 and the European Union by 40% by 2030. India, another major polluter, remains non-committal. In Africa, the continent's industrial powerhouse, South Africa, is also making a contribution towards carbon emission reduction. At the end of the Lima conference, parties to the Kyoto Protocol came up with a draft treaty that spells out what countries need to do to stop polluting the atmosphere.
Climate talks rarely finish on time, and these are no exception. Cracks have emerged along familiar fault lines. Who should bear the burden of cutting greenhouse gas emissions? But as talks continued, delegates of the most climate-vulnerable countries were hopeful for a deal.
We have survival stakes here, so we expect the best we can.
Okay.
It'll have to be something substantial.
Could this be a weak text that doesn't satisfy your needs?
All texts will satisfy this movement forward. We will figure out how to fix it if it needs fixing, but we need to have some agreement that we can carry forward to Paris.
Global negotiators are trying to prepare the elements for a new climate deal to be signed next year in Paris. But developing nations say the text doesn't include financial aid to help them cope with climate change, especially small islands.
As you've always said as small island developing states, there are things that you cannot adapt to. If you've lost your coral reefs, if you've lost coastlines, you can't adapt to that. So and loss and damage is important for us.
But richer nations like the US said a deal was crucial. The details could be ironed out next year.
Failing to produce the decision before us will be seen as a major breakdown and will deal a serious blow to the confidence of parties and others as we approach Paris.
Most delegates say the text is far from perfect, and no single country appears completely satisfied with the negotiations so far. But time is running out to find a compromise. Some observers say a bad deal is worse than no deal.
What we don't want to see here is something that locks us in to low ambition, that locks developing countries into having to make commitments that they don't actually have the capacity to meet because there's no finance.
But after 2 weeks of brokering, few countries will want to walk away from Lima empty-handed. Dan Collins, CCTV, Lima.
Now, parties to the Kyoto Protocol converged in Lima, Peru to assess strategies to combat climate change. Ways to help developing countries mitigate the vagaries of climate change also topped the agenda. UNEP's Executive Director, Dr. Achim Steiner, spoke to CCTV's Famida Miller ahead of the Lima meeting.
Achim Steiner, welcome to CCTV Africa. It's a pleasure having you here today.
Thank you very much.
Now, looking at the IPCC report, just to better understand its importance, can you explain to us how it was put together and especially its scientific relevance?
Well, for those who may not be familiar, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change actually had its origins in part here in the city of Nairobi, where UNEP's headquarters is, because when the world scientists began to talk well over 20 years ago about global warming, carbon emissions, it was still the very early stages of beginning to understand what was happening to the atmosphere, and in a sense the science was just beginning to emerge. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was then established in order to bring the world's best scientists together to evaluate research and data that is being produced by universities, research centers, governments across the world. It is under the auspices of UNEP and also the World Meteorological Organization, and is chaired by Professor Rajendra Pachauri. And the modus operandi of the IPCC is that in 5-year cycles it produces assessment reports. They are divided into different working groups that review the total available science, published science, refereed science, and then provide governments with an analysis of what the science tells us, both in terms of the science itself, how it is evolving. We are getting ever more information about what's happening in the atmosphere, its impacts on the ground, but also looking at opportunities and possibilities for responding to that challenge of climate change.
Now, those stark messages that you mentioned, a draft of that report has warned of severe, pervasive and irreversible impacts for people, species and 27 ecosystems unless action is taken. What kind of impact are you looking at?
Well, if you begin to appreciate that collectively we have managed to cause the atmosphere to warm, oceans to warm, we see the melting of ice and snow. We also see significant amounts of extreme weather events increasingly being part of the scenario of what climate change will mean. In its simplest terms, there is disruption of life as we know it. If sea levels rise by 70 to 100 centimeters, i.e. close to 1 meter by the end of this century, that's only about 86 years ahead of us, then hundreds of millions of people will be affected who live on the coastlines, our infrastructure. The magnitude of cyclones and hurricanes will increase exponentially. But also the extreme weather events that are associated, for instance, with droughts and floods. We have images from Thailand, from Pakistan, where significant parts of the country were literally flooded with millions of people being affected. This is the kind of disruption we're talking about, both to our natural systems, but also to the built-up environment, the infrastructure, the cities, the motorways, the power stations, which will be affected by these changes. And that is why the IPCC is presenting not only the science of what's happening in terms of carbon emissions, greenhouse gases going to the atmosphere, but also what it means to us here, down on the ground.
Now, I'm sure it can't be reiterated enough what actions need to be taken, but what is it that needs to be done, and especially with the reference to Africa?
Well, let me first of all say that governments agreed already in Copenhagen that a 2-degree limit in terms of global warming is what the world should strive for. That translates into a maximum amount of carbon emissions that we can still add to the atmosphere. It's a kind of carbon budget. Once we have drawn down that budget and we have reached the maximum limit, we will go over the 2-degree threshold. And that means that countries must basically confront the challenge that somewhere between the middle of this century and the latter part of the 21st century, we need to get to a point where human-caused emissions of carbon dioxide actually need to be zero net emissions. That means we are not emitting anything more than what nature can absorb. And clearly that is something that has fundamental implications, first of all, particularly for the major emitters in the world, who must move towards a low-carbon economy and low-carbon technologies. But for Africa in particular, which is not a major emitting part of the global economy, with 1 or 2 countries accepted, particularly the challenge of adaptation is so significant. UNEP published earlier this year something we call the Africa Adaptation Gap Report, in which we try to estimate how much would Africa have to spend in terms of adaptation investments just to stay in the same place that it would be today. And the amounts and the figures are truly challenging. $50 billion by 2050 just to cope with the impacts of climate change, which can range from sea level rise affecting coastal zones and infrastructure to perhaps also changing microclimates which lead to maybe diseases that don't exist in one area today, suddenly becoming prevalent in new areas. Populations being affected by the extreme weather events. It's not that droughts and floods are a new phenomena, but the frequency and also the magnitude of these extreme weather events may go far beyond anything that we have seen in recent times. So here are some of the examples of what both a climate change scenario means to Africa, but also how it translates in economic terms, in human welfare terms, and in its ability to respond.
Now, with regard to its ability to respond, is that the major challenge Africa faces in terms of adapting? Where will they get the money? Where will they get the resources?
Nobody can answer that question today. I mean, at the end of the day, Africa must now begin to look at what is the scenario under which it can mobilize these resources domestically and also with the international community. Certainly the agreement to establish a green climate fund that the international community is beginning to now also resource with commitments and contributions may be one source, but as I just mentioned to you, $100 billion a year is the objective that has been set for the green climate fund. But if Africa already has to spend $50 billion itself by the year 2050 per annum on adaptation, you can see that there is a major financing gap. And this is also a reason why, in addition to Africa looking at its own adaptation needs, Africa has a great deal of interest in also investing in a low carbon and also more resilient economy. This means trying to leapfrog into providing energy to its citizens by using renewable energies is one option. Investing in ecosystems, for instance, Africa has significant parts of the global tropical forest reserves. These are part of our climate regulatory system. These are assets that Africa brings also to the global effort of combating climate change, and hopefully through the United Nations Climate Change Convention, Africa will both be credited with making these contributions and receive also the financial, technology and capacity building support that it so urgently requires. Climate change affects everyone, and no one can sit back and not act is now an accepted reality.
Mr. Hakim-Stana, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Well, we'll take a short break now, and when we come back, my guests on the program will explore how developing countries that contribute little, if anything, to climate change through carbon emissions can open the wallets of developed countries to get the money needed in dealing with the problem. Welcome back to the program. Well, let's get some perspectives now, and I'm joined from Johannesburg to discuss this climate change mitigation funding for developed countries. Post Lima is Melita Steele, a senior climate and energy campaign manager for Greenpeace Africa. From Cairo is Dr. Ashraf Zaki, the Director General of Scientific Research at the Egyptian Meteorological Authority. And in studio here with me is Mr. Simon Otieno, an associate at the Institute for Climate Change and Adaptation here in Nairobi. Thank you very much for joining us here on the program. Melita, to you in Johannesburg. I'll start off with you now. Once again, the world has converged in Lima, Peru, to assess strategies to combat climate change for the developing countries, for Africa in particular. What are the concerns?
Well, I think the reality is that climate change is possibly the biggest threat facing the world at the moment. And it is developing countries who are on the front line of climate change. So climate change acts as a threat multiplier, and it takes existing vulnerabilities and makes them 100 times worse. And so what those countries are particularly looking out for from the negotiations is strong commitments from developed countries to actually reduce their emissions. So in that, South Africa is not exempt. So South Africa is on the African continent, but it is also a major emitter. But on top of that, in order to reduce emissions, in order to adapt to the impacts of climate change that are already happening, right, money and resources need to be shifted towards developing countries.
Well, that whole question of resources being shifted, though, Melita, we are seeing that the pledges and agreements that have been agreed in the past, though, not much, though, is being met by the contributors, the ones who had said that they would put these pledges on the table. I mean, what happens now? What is the realistic option for developing countries?
Well, there have been various structures that have been set in place. So the Green Climate Fund is supposed to be the sort of conduit for finances to flow from developed countries towards developing countries. Getting money into that fund has been a real challenge. What we have seen in Lima is that some countries have started making increased pledges towards giving money towards developing countries, but we're not anywhere near where we need to be. So setting up those structures is just the first step, making sure that there is new and additional money so that developed countries are not just putting money that they'd already allocated as aid into these funds so that developing countries can access them. But even then, so that developing countries can understand how to access the funds, right, is going to be the next important step.
All right. Simon, though, you're following this very closely from Nairobi here, though, but what was on the table, though, in Lima for African countries?
To me, I look at it in the perspective of an opportunity which came for them to put their case up in preparation for next year. And so if we look at the strategies they are adopting, emphasis not only for the Green Climate Fund, but also the adaptation issues where technology transfer could be very key, because the industrialized countries can give leeway to tunes of several millions of dollars, because technology transfer is a positive in their industries, but then we'll use that to boost our adaptation capacity. So those are some of the avenues which, if we look through, are quite pertinent in raising the levels of adaptation without actually pegging it all on the money. Right. So as the money comes in, a bit can be available in terms of technology transfer and ultimately resilience building for the developing countries.
Clearly, of course, the whole question of resources is a big challenge, though, for African countries. But in terms of adaptation, mitigation, where are the challenges for the continent?
It's only the policy issues are being addressed, and quite fast indeed, I can say. But our management practice is also another thing which is an inherent problem within the various government structures. So you find that climate change being highlighted and mainstreamed, but at the same time, the government ministries are overburdened by their original sector-based approaches to handling the issues. So climate change is cross-cutting, but at the same time, you have a problem of how do we address them and mainstream them within our sector issues. So that has been another drawback. But if indeed it can be taken forward through mainstreaming in different sectors, then even the funding internally for bilateral trade agreements can also be partly credited to these climate change efforts.
All right. Dr. Zaki, you're watching this, though, from Egypt, and Mr. Otieno is talking about mainstreaming here, policies and other challenges, though. What is the example, though, of Egypt?
In reality, first, let us agree that the climate change is a big issue for African countries. Especially most of the African countries produce a very little emission of the greenhouse gases. Of course, climate change is a big issue for the whole country, from the environmental sides or from economic sides. So it's very important that we can get something back to help the African countries, especially something, for example, for the infrastructure, for the capacity building. But let's agree that we really face big issues with climate change, especially for drought problems. So we must put this on the table, and we get very easy access to the fund which will be produced to the African countries.
All right. Melissa, to you, though, South Africa is quite a large emitter of pollutants here on the African continent. Of course, it's quite negligible, but it's still quite large there on the African continent. What are the strategies that South Africa is employing, though, to handle its issue?
Well, as far as Greenpeace is concerned, South Africa is playing a very proactive role in the international negotiations and is pushing for a deal that is fair and binding. But unfortunately, domestically, what is happening in South Africa is that the government is continuing to invest in coal, which means that we're building 2 of the biggest coal-fired power stations in the world at the moment, but also looking to expand our coal production. And so what that means is that the country is continuing to add to the impacts of climate change. That aside, the country does have a very good climate change policy, which needs to be implemented much more effectively. But as far as Greenpeace is concerned, the South African government needs to show a lot more commitment towards shifting away from coal and moving towards renewable energy, because the impacts of climate change are already here. And although the theory is that climate change must be mainstreamed in all government policies, we've yet to see that in South Africa.
All right, we are talking about government commitment here, and even as we ask the developed countries for funding, though, on the African continent, according to African governments, though, is there commitment?
I'd use the example of the Kenyan scenario, where at least signs in the energy sector have tended towards using renewable energy, and so quite a good target of the next 10 or so years, majority of our supplies for electric energy will be from renewable sources, if not 80%. So those are the positives, because if we are in a state where we are the developing countries, let's embrace the clean energy so that we are not part of the problem, but a solution which is ongoing, implemented by requirements and needs for the development of our countries. So we have also that positive status of developing in tandem with requirements for green energy. There's also the issue which is raised on coal use. Unfortunately, Kenya is also on the coal mining program. For the next few years, I think we'll be rolling out our coal mines. So again here, efficient, low emission is what should be targeted. Get the technology which is improved in terms of refinement of energy production using coal, and I think we'll be also able to contribute to the adaptation issues.
All right. Melita, though, are African countries preferring solutions here or simply waiting for the purse strings from the developed countries?
Well, I think that what is happening is that on the African continent, money is always an issue. So what you can afford to invest in is really the bottom line. Countries in Africa are still continuing to look to invest in coal and are also looking at nuclear investments, which are a different kind of problem. But we are seeing some countries starting to look to invest in renewable energy. And some countries are not waiting for the money to come first. But a lot of countries, including countries like South Africa, are saying that if countries are to move towards renewable energy, they are going to need enabling funds, and that is a prerequisite.
All right. Dr. Zaki, to you there in Cairo, though, of course, you've also had an issue regarding the Renaissance Dam and its associated problems from the Egyptian side. Are you seeing, though, that governments across the continent, particularly in the North African region where you are you seeing them taking a proactive step, though, in trying to assess or come up with strategies to combat that climate change?
As a matter of fact, the Egyptian government moved in the same line as our colleague mentioned as well. We start to invest a lot of money for the adaptation program and move to the clean energy production, like renewable energy in different fields and aspects. So the Egyptian government now invests a lot of money for different projects to produce clean energy which can give less emission. And also there is a lot of program for mitigation exist in Egypt. So the country, I believe they are moving on the right side to reduce the emission and to face the issues which can produce from the climate change with more adaptation programs, which put Egypt on the front line to resolve and solve the problems.
All right. Simon, though, your issue at the beginning of this program was that perhaps African countries or the developing countries did not go to Lima with a prepared position, though. What would you want to see moving forward from the continent?
When you tie political structures to the technology potentials of your country, then indeed you'll have a way forward in which all policies are well informed and implementation programs are rolled out in tandem with the requirements for the climate change, for example. But you have scenarios of professional inputs and political interests being a major impediment to the structures being put in place or implemented. So I'm looking at a scenario where if today we leave Lima, preparing for Paris next year, the political will to roll the government systems is not done, again we end up in Paris ill-prepared.
There is an absence of an Africa common position, that's your view?
To marshal it before the conference and have the agenda well placed and discussed.
All right. Melita, your view there, post-Lima, before Paris, what would you want to see from African countries? What kind of commitments should be coming out so that they're better prepared for Paris?
Well, I think the important thing is that the Paris negotiations next year is where we expect to see an agreement actually signed. I think the issues, so I've spoken to South African negotiators who have talked about negotiators from other African countries who absolutely do not have the same level of knowledge as they do. And so I think that even within the negotiations, it's really important that countries within the Africa bloc in particular are talking to each other, but making sure that they do have a common position and that they are unanimously calling for the same thing, which should be that the actual contributions to the Green Climate Fund must continue to flow, that the technology transfer, which was mentioned, actually is also implemented, but also that countries are enabled and empowered to access that money. But most important of all, that emissions reductions and the commitments that are made in line with science, which will avoid the worst impacts of climate change. It really is countries in Africa, developing countries, who are really already feeling the impacts and will continue to feel the impacts. And so it is up to them in these negotiations to strongly call for developed countries to actually come to the party and make strong commitments.
All right, Dr. Zaki, you have the final word on this.
Yeah, actually, if we talk about the fund which will be given to the African country, we need to know also very clearly how this money will be transferred to Africa and how we can easily access. For example, in Egypt, we have a strategy, as I said, to move toward the green energy production. And there is several projects which really need fund. For example, are we going to get this money through the African Bank, or how this money can be transferred to the continent? We need an easy way. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to access this money. Also, we need to be a little bit far from the political way to transfer the fund to the country. Let us make it on research level, for example.
All right, Dr. Zaki, Ashraf Zaki, we'll leave it there for the moment. From Johannesburg, discussing climate change mitigation funding for developed countries. Post-Lima is Melita Steele, a senior climate and energy campaign manager from Greenpeace Africa. In Cairo, Dr. Ashraf Zaki, the Director General of the Scientific Research at the Egyptian Meteorological Authority, and in studio with me, Mr. Dulo Simon Otieno, an associate at the Institute for Climate Change and Adaptation here in Nairobi. To you all, thank you very much for being on the program. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.